I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And today we're talking about The Tomorrow People, 1992 to 95 CITV series. The Tomorrow People was originally a show from the 1970s, created by Roger Damon Price, who also created, devised, wrote the first series of the 90s version. Whenever I've had any exposure to the 70s version of The Tomorrow People, it seemed to me typically alien-y, spacey, like all sci-fi at that sort of time really was. I think particularly about shows like Battlestar Galactica, Blake 7, Space 1999, and of course the classic Doctor Who, which was around all through the 70s and had started in the early 60s. But as it turns out, The Tomorrow People isn't as spacey, alien-y as those shows, but it is quite spacey, alien-y in its original incarnation. I'd originally formed the impression it looked to me like that Tomorrow People from the 70s wasn't really much about finding a kind of sci-fi fantasy change coming over you and incorporating that into everyday life, like Woof. And indeed like the 1990s Tomorrow People TV series, and I thought that was something I very much would prefer about the new version of the Tomorrow People. But looking closely, researching for this podcast, it looks like that was a big part of the 70s Tomorrow People series. But also they made a lot of the alien stuff, and there's a series where a particular character takes the series off and is off in another galaxy doing something. There's regular contact with aliens, good and bad, which is more like your sort of Doctor Who, Blake 7, typical 70s sci-fi stuff. Not that aliens are an entirely alien concept in the 90s TV series, as we'll come back to. One thing the 70s version undoubtedly does get right is that the Tomorrow People use the three tele-powers, which is really what makes them Tomorrow People. Or, as Lister might say on Red Dwarf, Man Plus, the next stage of human evolution, as they put it, or a kind of advanced stage of humanity.
I'm afraid I take issue with calling it the next stage of evolution because it doesn't fit in with how evolution works. Human beings haven't, over millions of years, been in situations where they would be killed if they couldn't teleport, and so the teleporting humans survived to pass on the genes. That's how evolution works, basically. It's really mutation, isn't it?
And if it is going to become human evolution, we'll all have to die out because we can't do the things the Tomorrow People can do. So it would be a very sudden, extreme form of evolution. And obviously the Tomorrow People themselves are not going to kill us because they can't be aggressive. They can't attack living things. And that's supposed to be part of their pointing the way forward for the good future of humanity and uniting the world in peace. Although, as we've sometimes said on podcasts, I'm sure, a bit of well-placed, restrained violence in certain situations may be necessary with the type of people there are around the world, so I'm not entirely convinced by that aspect of the Tomorrow People. But talking about the three tele-powers, I don't mean tele-powers like the Teletubbies or the Telebugs have, which is having a TV screen on their bodies that can show television. In this case, the three tele-powers of the Tomorrow People are telepathy, teleportation, and telekinesis. And apparently they do demonstrate all those regularly and use them properly in the 70s version. The 1990s Tomorrow People don't really use telekinesis, which we always found rather an omission and a bit disappointing. We were saying before watching the DVDs through, in preparation for this podcast, the 90s Tomorrow People should be using telekinesis to save the day, moving objects to hit the antagonists with their minds. friends. But that was before we were reminded, when we watched the first series of the 90s Tomorrow People, oh, we can't actually attack people.
Or perhaps, if they aren't going to be aggressive, removing things so that the bad people can't use them.
It is an omission, and there's one bit in the 90s series where there is some evidence of telekinesis starting to happen, with one Tomorrow person who's still quite new, sensing that two others are in danger, and starting to kind of lose a grip on her Tomorrow People powers because of it, and the pots and pans in the kitchen start moving. And that was the closest we really got to telekinesis in the series, which was a bit of a shame.
Their powers really are limited to teleportation and telepathy, aren't they? Two of the Tomorrow People were discovering those powers, and one of them said, I wonder what else we can do. And I said, nothing, which made you chuckle a bit. It was a slight exaggeration, but it also kind of wasn't, because if ever another power does crop up for convenience, or because Roger Damon Price likes it but his successors don't, it will go away again. The one that crops up and is then immediately forgotten about is the ability to hold your hand up to a security keypad sort of thing and make it glow red, and it'll open the lift for you, which is so silly when you could teleport into the lift without having to make up a stupid power that they can't really do.
Something that used to confuse us about the 70s TV series was the belts. We weren't sure. Now, if they're Tomorrow People and they have these powers naturally, why do they have to wear these belts to activate their powers? It turns out the belts don't really activate the powers, but they're kind of a link to the computer that can boost the powers. We were always glad, and I think still are, that they didn't have special belts in the 90s version.
It sounds to me like in the 70s they had to have a lot of sci-fi elements that they submitted with their pitch in order to get the show commissioned as a sci-fi show.
In the 90s version, they do have a base, which is an alien spaceship, so kind of links to the original alien sci-fi aspect definitely present there all through the 90s series. And it's kind of like the computer, artificial intelligence, in that it does react to the Tomorrow People and communicate with them and help them in certain ways. But it's not really like your artificial intelligence computer character, like Holly from Red Dwarf, Dynak X from Defenders of the Earth, and Complex with the baddies from Bucky O'Hare.
Intelligence from Team America. Which is really a piss take of that sort of thing.
The 1990s version of the Tomorrow People has 3 series, 5 stories, which can get quite confusing. The first series aired latterly in 1992 and is a 5-episode origin story. And then there are 2 series of 2 5-episode stories each, which aired at the beginning of 1994 and 1995. Between 1995 and Old School Weekend on CITV, I don't think we thought about the Tomorrow People very much for a period of about 18 years. But then they did show the first 2 episodes for Old School Weekend, which was a go-to point of reference on quite a few of our early podcasts, and seemed, and I suppose was, quite recent at that point. As we're recording this podcast now, Old School Weekend will be 10 years ago when we next get to a new year. But anyway, I was really hooked and interested by the first 2 episodes of the Tomorrow People first series origin story during Old School Weekend, to the extent that I actually bought the DVD set of the whole series. And when we watched it, we were slightly disappointed, I think it's fair to say. Certainly didn't enjoy it as much as we were hoping, and as much as I thought the first 2 episodes indicated we probably should. And indeed, when we were watching the DVDs through in preparation for this podcast, I was saying really the first 2 episodes are the best bit of the origin story, and it does kind of drop off in the next 2 before coming to a conclusion. The Tomorrow People they gather together for the first series are Christian Schmid as Adam, Kristen Ariza, not sure how to say that one, as Lisa, and Adam Pearce as Kevin. And certainly that was what the Radio Times told us were the 3 Tomorrow People, Adam, Lisa and Kevin. As it turns out, when you start watching the series, there is a fourth main young person character, Megabyte, who is, at that stage at least, Kevin's friend. And one good scene, memorable scene that we always remembered was from the final episode of the origin story, where Megabyte does break out as a Tomorrow person by teleporting when he's being dangled off the banisters by this character who we think is obviously a cyborg, but they don't go into it in the show, unfortunately. And he's played by an actor called Christian Tessier, who's Canadian. His surname is French-Canadian, isn't it? But the character, Megabyte, is from Vermont, which is, of course, on the Canadian border, so they can certainly get away with that.
He even puts maple syrup on everything, it's so close to Canada.
Indeed, an aspect that's very deliberate about that first series is that the three Tomorrow people, as it appears to be at the beginning, are from three different countries. Lisa is American, Adam is Australian, and Kevin is English. But subsequent Tomorrow people do turn out to be English, really, because that's where the show ends up being concentrated and being made. But it is very much a collaborative effort, this first series, with Thames Television from our country and Nickelodeon from the USA, putting in a combined effort to relaunch, reboot with a new universe, set of rules, set of characters, continuity, that's the word I was struggling for, the Tomorrow People series, which had been popular in the United States in its first incarnation, even though it was entirely made by the UK at that point. So there are several unique things about that first series, those first 5 episodes, the origin story, and that international flavour is definitely one of them. It's the only story in the 90s version that was written by Roger Damon Price himself, and it's also the only one where the sci-fi elements and the conflict is scientists slash government slash military versus the Tomorrow people. Official guys are finding out about the Tomorrow people and trying to capture them, use them for their own ends, which I believe is something that is from the 70s version, and a very likely and sensible and logical go-to for Roger Damon Price to make the main point of this origin story for the new incarnation. On the DVD box, it's got the quote from Adam about this stuff we can do. Of course, they want us to help them with their spying and their military plans, and imagine how afraid they'll be if our powers could be used against them. But that aspect of the show really is only in that origin story, and what you've got in the other 4 stories over 2 series is different sci-fi threats for the Tomorrow people to combat, while the government and the military really leave the Tomorrow people alone. Largely because, I think, and you can say this makes sense from a story point of view, the person in charge of trying to investigate, capture, get the Tomorrow people in the first series is Megabyte's dad, who's the first person really who becomes a Tomorrow people ally, and you can very much infer that he's kind of shut down Operation Find, Exploit, Trap, Dissect the Tomorrow people, because he knows it's not the right thing to do, particularly because his son is one of them. They're very careful in the first series about showing Megabyte's dad isn't evil, doesn't explicitly want to harm the Tomorrow people. There's this renegade guy under him, Colonel Masters, who's made a secret deal with the evil old British woman who wants to exploit the Tomorrow people. And General Damon, Megabyte's dad, has no knowledge of this, so he's not really, as it turns out, an antagonist. And when he describes himself to Megabyte as the chief bad guy, turns out your dad is the chief bad guy. They very carefully made that not really too much the case. General Damon is played by Jeff Harding, who also appeared on CITV as Mike One's dad on Mike and Angelo. And that's not the only link between the 90s Tomorrow people and Mike and Angelo by any means, as we shall come back to in a bit. I think definitely the 3 people I would say make the most of the 90s Tomorrow people and do the best job and go the furthest to make it well worth watching are Jeff Harding as Megabyte's dad, General Damon, Christian Tessier as Megabyte, and really, principally, Christian Schmid as Adam. And obviously someone realised that, because they are in all three series. Though they don't overuse General Damon, he's in one story each in series 2 and 3. He's in stories 1, 2 and 5. While Adam and Megabyte are two characters in every single episode, and really turn out to be the crux of the show. And obviously this wasn't expected when the first series was planned and made. Here's the Tomorrow People, Adam, Lisa and Kevin, and oh look, Megabyte's actually one too. But that's how it turned out. One thing that I always remembered about Megabyte was that his real name, which he didn't go by because he didn't like it very understandably, was Marmaduke. His surname, of course, and I've mentioned it, as his dad's surname is Damon, from Roger Damon Price, I'm sure. In the first series, Megabyte's dad calls Megabyte Junior, kind of implying that Megabyte's dad's first name is Marmaduke as well. Whereas in story number 5, the second half of series 3, The Living Stones, General Damon is Bill, so they've forgotten about that. But yes, a vital ingredient to really making any sort of success of the show at all was Christian Schmid, who, of course, as everybody knows, had just finished playing Todd Landers on Neighbours. I think he's very much a method actor in that he is, or was at the time, a very pleasant, charming, handsome, fun, young Australian guy who's just rather pleasing to have on the telly. Having said that, he does do the acting very well and bring the character to life very well. One thing he particularly does is something that the cast of Jurassic Park are so good at, which is making the character nice, fun, affable, rather than snipey, moany, get at you with certain lines and certain situations to other characters, which is very important to make the character likeable and relatable and a good heart of the show. And he does have a tremendous amount of chemistry with Christian Tessier as Megabyte. Quite accidentally, of course. In the first series, they don't meet until the very final scene. Adam and Megabyte, they've been doing things in different places during the series, and they finally come together at the end after the exciting conclusion with the other two Tomorrow People and Megabyte's dad and Lisa's mum. And what's the first thing Adam and Megabyte do when they meet each other? I always described it as they throw their arms round each other. It was a bit less extravagant than that, as it turned out, but they certainly do grasp each other and grin, and are very pleased to meet each other, and rightly so, because they become a huge part of each other's lives. Christian Tessier is very good as well at doing the acting, and that's why for the second series he is promoted from, here's the fourth starring person, up to the second under Christian Schmid, and why he sticks around as one of the mainstay Tomorrow People all through. He could have done with some more input on inflections and emphasis at times, was our only little gripe about him as we watched through. But certainly, yes, Megabyte is a vital part of the show. Lisa is only in that first series. Partly, I'm sure, because American Nickelodeon involvement peters out after the first series. But something that struck us at Old School Weekend, and whenever we watched the DVD, she's not very good, is she, Lisa?
Well, she's not up to the standard of Christian Schmid and Christian Tessier, the two Christians. She gives it a go, but quite honestly, she's not up to the standard of most young American actors that you see. She's perhaps a bit of a budget one. I don't think she's terrible, and I do think that you get what she's trying to convey.
It's quite easy to spot that they think they're going to have a ship between Adam and Lisa, and of course they don't, because Lisa disappears, and they don't really have the chemistry, certainly not the chemistry that Adam and Megabyte have. And I did once read a website that was explaining about fanfiction terms, and its definition of pre-slash was a story where Adam and Megabyte are building up to having sex but don't actually do it yet. And I can very much see why someone may have picked them as an example of the type of characters who you could certainly get the idea of pre-slash from. But you were saying while we were watching at this time, Adam and Lisa's ship would have been quite a nice one, and one that wouldn't get done in that way in modern times, because it's based on mutual help, support, understanding, and being nice to each other.
Yes, I did notice that, particularly nowadays when no one seems to be able to manage to create a ship without it being love-hate and badly done love-hate at that, such as Hermione and Ron, anyone you might see in a Disney movie nowadays, and a lot of the novels that I read the blurbs of, young adult fiction particularly, and I think, oof, not another one, and reject it on those grounds.
And the saga of Kevin is a funny old thing, because there is an unbroadcast pilot version of the origin story with Christian Smith, Kristen Ariza, and Christian Tessier in the same roles, as well as some other actors in the same roles, like Hugh Quashie from Holby City as the kind of bumbling scientist English guy. And some of the scenes from the pilot are actually in the TV version. They didn't refilm a lot of the Adam and Lisa stuff, some of the Megabyte stuff not involving Kevin. But they did recast Kevin for the final broadcast TV version. We were quite surprised to read, having watched the first two episodes, that Kevin, Adam Pearce, who we'd just seen, was a recast. And in the original unbroadcast pilot, there was another Kevin that wasn't good enough, and they replaced him. I mean, that original Kevin must have been atrocious, mustn't he? Because even at Old School Weekend, we noticed the Kevin they end up with is really bad.
Perhaps the original Kevin didn't even really seem to try. Latterly, at least, Adam Pearce gives it a go. I really noticed it when he didn't react to Megabyte saying, "You're a superhero." And there's a close-up on Adam Pearce's face, and his face isn't doing anything. Later on, when things happen, like General Damon says, "Could you teleport with something, like me?" he'll do something with his face, but it's really very inadequate.
I was thinking the kind of acting Adam Pearce does would be quite good in a school play. You think, oh yeah, he's bringing it to life, he's putting in some effort. But for this Tomorrow People, it's really not good enough. And obviously that's been spotted, because he doesn't completely disappear like Lisa, but he is only in one other story, the first half of the second series, the Kulex experiment, and he's in a coma for the whole thing. And then he just completely disappears. And Adam Pearce didn't do any more acting after that, so perhaps he decided it wasn't for him, he didn't like it. The Tomorrow People makers were probably quite pleased if they'd said to him, well, maybe you can be in one of the Series 3 stories, they didn't have to go through with it. Because it seems very odd to think they weren't going to bring him back at all, when they did include him in the second series at all.
Or maybe they realised what rubbish he was, put him in the coma so they could satisfy contracts and parents and things, and then completely ghosted him because they hated him. But I think I remember being quite surprised by this when I first saw the series in the 90s, thinking, oh, he was supposed to be one of the main ones, wasn't he? Not having noticed that he was rubbish. But then I think after I got used to it, I thought, oh, I do prefer this, actually. Adam and Megabyte is all you really need.
You get to the middle of the second series, and you think back to the original Radio Times listing, Adam, Lisa, Kevin, and we've had two stories, and it's just Adam. Oh, well, Megabyte's still there, he was in the first series, but, oh, well, he's not really an original Tomorrow person. He broke out at the end of the first series. I keep saying broke out like that. Breaking out is the expression for when you discover you're a Tomorrow person. Used quite extensively in the 70s series, I believe, and used 3 times, as it turned out, in Series 3 of the 90s Tomorrow People, just kind of thrown in there as homage to the 70s version. But quite a useful expression to use when you want to talk about finding out you're a Tomorrow person. When we get to that exciting conclusion of the origin story, where everyone ends up on the South Sea Island with the Tomorrow People headquarters spaceship having got away from the real antagonists of the series, there's the moment that should be really good and powerful and exciting for Kevin, where he takes the initiative, takes the risk, rushes in and grabs Lisa's mother and teleports her away. And that leaves the others free to teleport away as well, because she was the bad bad guys hostage that was stopping Adam and Lisa from teleporting away. That should be a brilliant moment for Kevin, a power moment for Kevin, but it was really flat because we didn't buy into Adam Pearce as Kevin at all. Contrast it to another moment from the first series, earlier in the first series.
The antagonists have set up a trap involving all kinds of complicated electronic equipment for when Lisa teleports back to the spot she vanished from, and Megabyte picks up a chair or something and smashes up all the equipment and urges her to teleport, Lisa, teleport. And as Adam points out when he hears about it later, he must have known he couldn't get away. So Megabyte is very, very brave to do that, and we, the audience, really feel that and invest in that because of the performance of Christian with a C.
Yeah, and that must have been one of the things that was so enticing about first two episodes on Old School Weekend. That power moment for Megabyte, that real bit of bravery for Megabyte, completely throwing himself into the hands of the baddies, and Megabyte does end up captured and taken around in the suitcase and accompanied by the cyborg woman to the toilet and things for quite some time after that. He's in quite some trouble. And it's also quite cool that he does use his own ingenuity to escape from that situation in the end. And it's even more build up to the bit where he breaks out and teleports away when he's hanging off the banisters in the final episode. And really that goes to show how important the performance of the actors in bringing the characters to life, or not in the case of Kevin, is. As I said, the other four stories all have a piece of sci-fi, an antagonist using sci-fi or being a bit of sci-fi for the Tomorrow People to combat. I was saying to you while watching it, I wonder if I'd prefer it if there wasn't other sci-fi and the Tomorrow People were using their powers, lacking the telekinesis as they are, to combat everyday problems, like Woof. And you said quite truly the problem with that would be it would be too easy for them. So it has to be sci-fi stuff that they're investigating and they don't really know what's going on. So really, yes, that is the right way for the show to go. The trouble is, they don't really use their powers to actually save the day at the end, even though they do a lot of teleporting around to investigate. Series 2 and 3 are written by Lee Pressman and Grant Cathro. Roger Damon Price isn't so actively involved anymore. We mentioned Lee and Grant on our Michelangelo podcast because they wrote all of that, and they wrote a great deal of children's television. But of course, that is another link to Michelangelo. Mike number 2 appears in Series 2 of The Tomorrow People, playing a small but amusing role. I think Lee and Grant may have struggled to really incorporate the powers of the Tomorrow People into the sci-fi stories. And they're good sci-fi stories, particularly the two that make up Series 3. But actually adapting the powers of the Tomorrow People into the denouement seems to be a problem. And it's something that has bothered me about the show when I watched it on DVD, and I think really is a glaring omission. And if an ideal version of that Tomorrow People were to be made, it would be one of the very first things to try and tidy up. As has also been mentioned, the second story, the first part of Series 2, is called The Kulex Experiment, and the sci-fi is that Dr. Kulex, played by Jean Marsh of Upstairs Downstairs fame, has created this hybrid mosquito, which is so venomous, and she wants to steal Connie Booth's organic life-duplicating machine to make a whole swarm of these mosquitoes, and she should then threaten to release them on the world if she's not made world president or something, but it seems she's planning to just release them and see what happens. That was a rather poorly realised aspect of that series, exactly what Dr. Kulex was going to do with her sci-fi, and why. Quite a memorable plot. We did always remember the basics of it from the 90s. Another memorable thing about it is that as Lisa has disappeared, there is a direct replacement for her, really.
We have read at some point an interview with Lee and Grant where they admitted they didn't like Lisa. They didn't think she was very good. Then they went on to say that in finding a replacement, they were very pleased to discover Naomi Harris, who played Amy. And they can say that with great credibility because she went on to have a very successful acting career as an adult.
Notably, she's been Miss Moneypenny with Daniel Craig. She's also in the Pirates of the Caribbean films and all sorts of things.
I agree that she's an improvement on poor Christina Rieser, although we're not going to heap praise on her, are we? I think there are some things to do with her acting that she's worked on and improved since The Tomorrow People. One thing that you pointed out was that she gestures with her arms too much.
She does get very whiny sounding when she's trying to be intense. But certainly she's a lot more watchable and believable than Lisa and Kevin.
The two Christians being the main assets of the show and the ones that they hang on to does mean getting another English Tomorrow person means there's still an English, an American and an Australian one, so that works out pretty well.
It was in our Flintstones podcast that I was saying sometimes you watch things and Jeopardy is happening and you think, didn't that character have a superpower at one point that could help in this situation and now they're just not using it? In the case of the Flintstones, it was a denouement of the 1994 movie with Bam Bam and his super strength. But it's another issue I have with Lee and Grant writing The Tomorrow People. A lot of the time, they seem to forget they have these special powers, and they could be using them to good effect when they're not. And it's not just at the denouements. Amy says to her mother, like Lisa, she has an overprotective featured mother. I can't teleport you to Australia because we only use our powers when we really need to. And I say, yes, and sometimes not even then, which is true. I find it particularly striking in the Kulaks experiment because of Kevin and the mosquito, really. Now, Kevin has seen this mosquito bite the guy and put him into a coma and is trying to call the police about it, and the mosquito turns up in the phone booth with him. Why doesn't he just teleport away instead of standing there swatting at the mosquito like a normal person would do? He should just teleport away, but doesn't because they want him in a coma for the series. The whole setup for that fails to take into account that they're Tomorrow People. Megabyte is waiting for Kevin at the station and Kevin is late. Kevin's racing down there on his bike. He should teleport there. He should have communicated telepathically with Megabyte to say, well, sorry I'm late. Even if he didn't want to teleport, I'm just going to come down on my bike and meet you. And Megabyte would telepathize back and say, okay, Kev, see you in a minute and stuff. But they don't do any of that. As we were working out, it's more forgivable with Amy and the mosquito trap scene. Amy's only just breaking out. She hasn't teleported on her own yet. She calls to Adam and Megabyte for help to teleport away from the mosquito, and that happens, so that's okay. But then in the second half of that second series, when Amy and Megabyte are in the lift, and the knockout gas is coming out of the vents, do they teleport away? No, what do?
They pass out and get captured and stuff.
Having first swatted at the gas, like Kevin was swatting at the mosquito. If you're a Tomorrow person, don't swat at anything. Teleport away from it. Even if it's a split-second thing and you don't know where you're going to go, just blindly teleport to the spaceship and take stock there. At times they do use the spaceship as a place of refuge to stop and think and have some of the special orange juice that the spaceship gives them to rejuvenate them, but they don't do that enough, which is really part of not actively being Tomorrow People enough. That's reminded me, another memorable part of the first series is the healing power that Adam demonstrates. When the agent guy falls off the roof, Adam goes to heal him, and the baddies are like, whoa, look what these people can do. And of course he's originally found that healing power when Lisa was burned, and Adam healed the burn.
And that's what I was really referring to when I said a power that Roger Damon Price's successors, Lee and Grant, don't want.
They really have to have decided, well, that's too useful, too much of a fix. They can't use that.
Exactly the same as that power of the manacle in the Mummy cartoon.
It's very like that, because you get to a later situation. In the case of the Mummy, it's Evie is dead. We can't just have the manacle bring her back to life like it's supposed to be able to. In the Tomorrow People, in the Kulak's experiment, that healing power should easily be able to cure anyone who's been bitten by the mosquito, I'd have thought. Adam used it in the first series to cure full body trauma of the guy who'd fallen off the roof. It should certainly be able to oust a bit of poison. But no, they have to forget all about it for the sake of the show. Having said all that, the one thing the Kulak's experiment does really do that the next three stories don't is have Adam, who really does most of the denouement stuff, which I'm not saying is a bad thing, use his teleportation power to actually save the day. When Dr. Kulak's, in her final fit of madness, has chucked the antidote over the gantry, Adam teleports in and catches it, which is a good denouement, and a memorable one, I always remembered that, but it's not something that's lived up to in subsequent stories. Of course, in that scene, Dr. Kulak's does a bit of a Disney villain thing and falls to her death. There's not really a lot of death, explicitly, certainly, in the Tomorrow People. And in the second half of Series 2, the villains were all shown very clearly to have survived after the denouement, but I suppose Dr. Kulak's was mad enough and evil enough that she was okay to hurl herself madly to her death at the end. We weren't too keen on that whole antidote sequence at the end of the story because they had a much better idea about getting Connie Booth, a genius at the same level, to analyse the mosquito sample and synthesise an antidote. But it's more of a fix-all. Dr. Kulak's is like, aha, I already have this antidote, in exchange for the code to start up the duplicating machine. Kind of quick, convenient writing there. And then everyone comes bursting in and Connie Booth is like, she's got the antidote, but you've already given her the duplicating machine code and the mosquitoes are being copied, so why has she still got the antidote? That didn't really make sense. It was supposed to be a final deal, no tricks, but it doesn't seem to have gone through properly. Fairly typical of those Lee Pressman and Grant Cathro stories, I think. A bit muddled, a bit misuse of the sci-fi, needed some work, but a great deal of potential showing through, which is why it's worth making a podcast about.
At the time, when we were children first watching it, we didn't really notice any of these problems. We found it very compelling, and that's the important thing, really, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. In many ways, it's a curse coming back and watching the DVDs and analysing and overthinking all these things. But it's also quite fun.
Having said that, I never remembered a damn thing about the next story, Monsoon Man, from the 90s, or even from one watch of the DVD to the next. I forgot all about it.
The only thing I remember about it from the time is looking in the Radio Times and seeing Adam, Megabyte, Amy guest stars and thinking, well, where is Kevin then? He's out of his coma. Why isn't he in the gang like he's supposed to? But the details, the plot, the characters are very forgettable, and we were watching it through this time, and I was saying, I can't remember how it ends, whether they're going to use their Tomorrow People powers properly to save the day. I remember the basic idea, which is that the sci-fi is about a weather satellite that can actually control the weather, being used by this serial mogul, played by William Hootkins, to wipe out the cereal crop of his rivals, which reminds me very much of what Robert Vaughan's character is trying to do in Superman 3, with a weather satellite and coffee rather than cereal.
Another amusing comment I made was at the denouement of that story arc, where the serial man is saying, ha ha ha, now I will be the top-selling cereal manufacturer of the world. And I said, it's not very high stakes, is it?
And they tried to make it more high stakes by having Adam speculating about, if he's messing up the weather there, it'll mess up the world climate and things will go wrong. That may have been a later addition, I think, when someone realised, it's all about this stupid cereal thing.
Deadly mosquitoes and mad scientists is a bit more exciting. It's just a shame that she didn't know what she was going to do with them, as you were saying earlier. There's sort of something missing from both those story arcs.
The guest kind of goody protagonist in Monsoon Man is a wannabe investigative journalist. She's one of these characters who feels she's too good to start at the bottom and cover a dog show, which we found rather annoying. Adam has a bit of a thing for her, but like Lisa, we never see her again after that story. And she's called Lucy. And the other two main guest stars, apart from Colonel Cobb and the editor of the newspaper, Mr. Bishop, which reminds us of Neighbours, because Christian Smid could be heard in that saying Mr. Bishop to Harold, are this kind of villain comedy double act like on the New Adventures of Superman that rankles so much, particularly with you.
Yes, it reminded me very much of that element of the New Adventures of Superman, which was inspired by Lex Luthor and Otis in the Christopher Reeve movies, I believe. And the thing is that that kind of forced comedy never works. To come up with these kind of caricatures and ask a couple of actors to play them really sticks out that that is what they've done. They're a sort of eccentric science guy and a bad-tempered heavy, aren't they? They're kind of overwritten.
The kind of heavy muscle character in that one is played by Kerry Shale, who isn't actually that heavy or muscular, and I always think it'd be better if he was bigger than the scientist and more of a physical threat. But I do think it's rather misuse of Kerry Shale. I do enjoy him in other things, like as Mr. Beaver in the BBC's Narnia, voiceover work he's done for things like Transylvania Pet Shop, a guest role as a computer in one of the more recent series of Red Dwarf. But I think he's rather misused there, and the character really misfires. Yeah, we're very clearly shown those two characters getting taken away by the police at the end, and Colonel Cobb, William Hootkins, having been struck by lightning, is taken away by the police as well, with comedy blacking all over him. So we see, yes, they haven't died. What do the Tomorrow People do at the denouement? Well, Amy and Megabyte just sort of stand there, and Adam drives the truck that's got the weather-changing equipment in it away and knocks the satellite dish off the roof, so that the weather satellite is no longer causing problems. So again, that's good work from Adam. I was saying, the trouble with that is anyone could have done that, not just a Tomorrow person. But then the truck did explode, so Adam had to teleport away from the exploding truck, which normal people can't do, but not a very satisfying Tomorrow People-y denouement there, unlike the Kulex experiment. I think we've always thought, and we still do, the third series contains the two best stories. The first is the Ramesses connection, which I found extremely memorable from when it was first on, and I do enjoy. It's quite an intricate sci-fi story with lots of investigation and stages and layers to unravel, and lots of interesting Egyptology, use of Cleopatra's needle and its fellow needles, which is not exactly the same as where and how the needles are in our world. There's more of them and they're in different places, but it's used in a very interesting way. Like good sci-fi, you can see where it comes from in the real world. The main guest star is Christopher Lee, who always puts in an entertaining, powerful performance, and he plays Pharaoh Ramesses, who's trying to live forever, and Elizabeth Spriggs is trying to stop him from doing so, is how I summed up that series at one point, and that is the crux of it, really.
That was you telling me your memory of it from the 90s before the DVD came along.
I did enjoy studying the Egyptians at school, and the idea Christopher Lee was this Egyptian pharaoh living forever, the pyramids were important, I did find very appealing. And I still do enjoy that story a lot. Perhaps it's the one whose content I actually enjoy the most. Although for various reasons, the final story, The Living Stones, which we'll come on to soon, I think is overall the best 5-episode story. Which is why I said Series 3 is very much the best series. It has the two best stories in it. One thing I'm not so sure about, and we were discussing in the Ramesses connection, is the idea that Tutankhamun was one of the first Tomorrow People, yet he lived 3,000 years ago. Now, it really seems like, certainly in the origin story, it's a very new phenomenon. Young people starting to break out as Tomorrow People. It's been happening over the past few weeks or months, rather than it started to happen 3,000 years ago, but now it's really happening on a larger scale. Not so sure about that one. Adam says in the first series the spaceship's been waiting there in the sand. It knew teleporters would develop on Earth someday. Did Tutankhamun accidentally teleport there one time, find himself on the spaceship, which had been waiting 3,000 years less than it ended up waiting for the proper Tomorrow people at that point? Not too sure about that idea, and really the whole thing could have done without it. We were really noticing how they were very free in Series 2 with letting people in on the secret. I was saying General Damon was the first Tomorrow People ally who was in on the secret. There were quite a few in Series 2, including Connie Booth, who seems very at ease with the whole situation of meeting the Tomorrow People and working with the Tomorrow People, and they don't really go into it because there's so much going on. Another one who's in on it from the Kulex experiment is Kevin's aunt, who's helping throughout the story quite a lot. Quite a convincing piece of casting, really, because she is about as bad at acting as Kevin. In Monsoon Man, they very easily let Mr. Bishop and Lucy and the guy who's been tied up and put in the cupboard in on the secret. So it's particularly surprising when we come into Series 3, the Ramesses connection, when there's a character who really should be let into the loop as a Tomorrow person ally, and they're so cagey with her for absolutely no reason. It's the Egyptian expert woman from the British Museum, who I call Colette from Casualty, but she has been in other things as well, and they go to her for help and information. She makes the very interesting point, and I may have mentioned this on the Mummy podcast, that we don't know what ancient Egyptian sounds like. Hieroglyphics have been decoded thanks to the Rosetta Stone in relation to modern languages written down. But she does help them to decode what Tutankhamun was telling them by remembering an old man she met in Egypt who claimed to be over 120 years old and used certain words that had passed down, including Mahaba, as in the Mahaba stone, which is an important part of that story. And then they go back to this character, Dr. James, later, to talk about the hidden tomb of Ramesses, where he's faked his death and buried a weighted coffin, like in Psycho. And Adam uses one of these occasional Tomorrow People powers of photographic memory to recreate this mural from the tomb, which explains all about how Christopher Lee has become immortal using the power of the stars, the light from this star system. It's all very intricate and quite interesting and pleasingly sci-fi. But they're so cagey with her about what these things mean and how they found them and what they're trying to do, and there's absolutely no reason for it. What they should say, which they're quite happy to say to other people, is, well, we're the Tomorrow People. Here, look at some of our powers. We're investigating this pharaoh who's trying to live forever and has already lived over 4,000 years. Teleported down to his tomb, found this mural, which I've now done a drawing of. Could you help us work it out?
She's a bit like Bo and She-Ra, who nobody wants to be in on the secret when people in the exact same position as him have been.
I watched just Series 3 on DVD last year, and then we watched through the whole thing this year in preparation for the podcast. And it struck me then, well, why aren't they telling her? Why aren't they letting her in as a Tomorrow Person ally? And then my disapproval and astonishment of this was increased tenfold while we were watching Series 2, and everyone was in on it for a lot less reason than we actually need to tell her this so she'll help us to defeat the sci-fi antagonist. So those are two aspects of that story that I think could do with improvement, Dr. James and Tutankhamun. But as I say, overall, I do like that one quite a lot. Again, at the end, sadly, they don't really use their powers to save the day. Again, it's Adam who actually does something. He climbs up to remove the Mahaba stone, which is focusing the light down on Christopher Lee to renew his immortality. I said to him, why don't you teleport up there and get it? Do you have to know you're teleporting onto something solid? We haven't heard anything like that before. But no, he's climbing. And like in Monsoon Man, Amy and Megabyte just stand there doing nothing. You've got Elizabeth Spriggs and the other forces of goodness spirits, one of them played by Anthony O'Donnell from Santa Claus the movie, sort of dancing around and trying to distract Christopher Lee and his main underling helper, who's played by the actor who played King Miraz on the BBC's Narnia. But that doesn't really come to much, and it ends up with Ramesses' cat trying to shoot eye beams at Adam, like he's done earlier in the series when Christian Schmid was doing some rollerblading, some somebody looked back at early Todd Neighbours and said, oh, we should get Christian Smith to do some rollerblading on the Tomorrow People, which isn't a displeasing thing to watch at all.
He steals somebody's rollerblades and they're going, hey, what are you doing? And he says, Megabyte will pay you, which I thought was quite amusing.
But it's all a bit confused and rushed and not well thought through, not a satisfying denouement. Adam's up on the sort of wall structure, reaching for the Mahaba stone, the cat shooting at him, things start exploding, and then suddenly, oh, Christopher Lee's gone, everything's fine, that's the end. It's like they used to tell me when I was writing stories at secondary school. It's got a lot of build-up and backstory, and I've obviously cared a lot and worked very hard on that, and then suddenly, oh, that's the end. It hasn't been finished off properly. Which is a common problem, and it's a shame not to leave it at secondary school and sort it out by the time it gets on the telly. What turns out to be the final story, the second half of Series 3, is The Living Stones. And this is the one story in the 90s Tomorrow People that does have aliens. Obviously, as I've said, the spaceship has been there, the existence of aliens has been established, but this is the only one with aliens in the story. The antagonists are aliens, and it's about an alien invasion of Earth, which perhaps fans of the old Tomorrow People series might have enjoyed, because I think it is more akin to the sort of thing those Tomorrow People used to do. Like the Ramesses Connection, it is a good story, well pulled off. And another interesting thing about it, as well as the fact that it has aliens in it, is that it doesn't have Amy. She and her mother are in one scene, which I've already mentioned, where they're going off to Australia. And they've left it open as to whether she's coming back for any future series, or they're actually emigrating. They don't specify, and it could be either. But she is replaced in that story by Alexandra Milman as Jade. And that is the other connection, common actor with Michelangelo. She played a character called Melanie, who was a friend, associate, contemporary of Mike number 2 in the two series in 1993 and 94, which have Mike number 2 and Auntie Rita and Tim Whitnell as Angelo. When we look up Alexandra Milman, it says Michelangelo Melanie. I think, oh yes, I do remember that character. And obviously, it was off the back of being in Michelangelo with Lee and Grant that they said, hey, let's have her as Jade in The Tomorrow People. And we always remembered from the 90s that Jade broke out as a Tomorrow person during that series, The Living Stones. We hadn't remembered just how late in the series it actually happened.
Last episode. As far as we're aware, we're watching only 2 Tomorrow People, but 80% of that storyline.
It's really in that one that Adam and Megabyte do have a lot of great chemistry, and I think really look like Kree/Slash when they're hitting each other with cushions and planning how they're going to spend the evening together. There's pizza, there's videos, there's a pillow fight, and who knows where it may lead if Dad hadn't rung up.
Megabyte's telling Adam he's going to organise all these things, my treat. But there's just one thing. Do you have any money? And that's one of those times when Christian Schmid could go, oh, for God's sake, Megabyte is such a twat, with his face, if not with his words. But instead he laughs. Like, oh, that Megabyte.
You're watching Adam and Megabyte there, and you're thinking about Megabyte originally and how he was Kevin's friend. He's forgotten all about Kevin, and very understandably so, I suppose. But it shows how the series characters have developed in a way they weren't expecting at first.
Jade was briefly introduced in the Culex experiment as a child with a dog who gets bitten by a mosquito and has to take it to Kevin's aunt, who's suddenly a vet for that bit. She played that part very well, having a nice fun walk with her dog and then being upset and crying when it's in this coma. They do retcon her involvement a bit. She's suddenly had her photograph taken with Megabyte, had a crush on Megabyte, and been told all about the Tomorrow People, and she starts her role in the Living Stones fully informed about them.
Retroactively, there's another person they let in on it at the drop of a hat in Series 2. But yeah, Alexandra Melman as Jade is definitely our third favourite Tomorrow person performance by quite some way. She's very good, very natural, very believable. and she is a big part of what makes the Living Stones so successful. She's investigating the meteor seed pod alien invasion. She's reacting to Megabyte's dad. She's meeting up again with Adam and Megabyte and getting involved in the whole thing. And is worried that her mother and everyone in her village has been possessed by aliens, body snatchers. Very like invasion of the body snatchers.
Rightly so, because they have.
And she does all that extremely well and believably, and she does that thing I like, where it's like, yeah, she's a real person in a real situation, and if it happened in your real life, this is how it would be. Like Woof. Jade has a new dog there, of course. I don't think particularly because they're trying to say the little black dog didn't survive its encounter with the mosquito. I'm sure it did because the antidote was there at the end. But they do need her to have a bigger dog in the Living Stones that can carry the seed pod around and just be more of a physical on-screen presence than the little black thing. And Jessie the dog makes a very good contribution to the show as well.
She doesn't really realise she's supposed to be indicating that she would like to go investigating with Jade at one time, does she? She's rolling around on the floor saying, "Oh, pat my tummy," and Jade's having to say, "No, you can't come with me."
A notable guest star in that one is Danny John Jules as a character called Byron Lucifer, who's this rock star who's making a comeback, and the aliens actually choose him as their leader, or the human they want to possess with their leader, because they want his comeback concert, they want his sound equipment and his audience to get their germinated seeds out to the populace. So Danny John Jules does most of the kind of spokesperson work for the aliens. He does it in the style of, as I say, it reminds me of Good, ironically, Cat from Series 5 of Red Dwarf, Demons and Angels. And you were saying perhaps Byron Lucifer's style of music and singing didn't suit Danny John Jules as much as most of the other singing styles he does, like Barrington's singing and rapping and Tongue-Tied from Red Dwarf.
Yes, it's sort of heavy metal rock kind of thing, isn't it? It doesn't suit him as well. He was probably very glad to have some singing with the role.
Byron Lucifer's concert is very important because it's where the denouement takes place. And again, anyone could do it, not just Tomorrow People. This time, it's not just Adam in on the action, which is a nice change. Megabyte has discovered during the course of the series that the aliens can be destroyed by bright light. There's clues throughout, because when they possess the people have to wear sunglasses and pull the curtains and so on. And Megabyte eventually remembers, takes him rather longer than it should, I feel, that, hey, we can destroy them with bright light. So, of course, Adam joins in, because he's always in at the denouement, and Megabyte turn on all the bright lights, floodlights at the concert hall, and destroy the aliens that way. And it's kind of an anticlimax. It happens all very quickly, and it's quite easy to do, just turn on the lights and they all sort of dissolve. And it would have been more difficult to do if all the aliens hadn't left everyone's bodies. What you have to do is make the aliens want to leave their hosts by knocking out, incapacitating the people they're possessing, and then destroy the green floating alien bit with bright light. And luckily, our heroes are able to do this, because one of the guest characters, General Beaumont Savage, has, against the advice and wishes of everyone, the Tomorrow People, General Damon, come along and try to blow up the aliens. And in doing so, he's made the stage collapse and knock out everyone who's possessed. Rather luckily, none of them are seriously injured by this, and the aliens decide to leave all the bodies so that Megabyte can then remember, let's kill them with bright light. So it's a bit of a quick, convenient fix at the end, a bit of an anticlimax. Again, it's finishing the story where it really falls down.
Another thing going on in that storyline is Beth, the botanist, a friend of the Damon family, an American woman who's discovered a way to increase the speed of the germination of seeds, which is why the aliens want her, because they germinate like seeds. And she gets herself locked up in an exploding boiler room with Jade, and Adam is able to teleport Beth out of there, but Megabyte unfortunately gets knocked out by a metal pipe or something before he can get Jade out, so that's when she breaks out as a Tomorrow person.
Beth and her germination machine was reminding you of Connie Booth and her organic matter duplication machine.
I said it was better because it makes more sci-fi sense to speed up a biological process than to reproduce matter, and we know what the aliens want. They want to inhabit the bodies and the planet of people. A bit like the Olmecs, really, from the Mysterious Cities of Gold. They want to live, to survive, at the expense of the rest of us.
Yes, their survival relies on wiping out whole other civilizations, which I seem to remember was the basic concept of the aliens in Independence Day.
That's the danger in the alien movies too, isn't it? They lay their eggs in your tummy and kill you when they hatch.
That's right, a species that's dependent on the destruction of others for its own survival. And human beings aren't dependent on the destruction of other species for their own survival, but certainly it's something that's been cared about a lot less than it should over the years. So perhaps in that way, such alien menaces are a reflection of ourselves. I mentioned General Beaumont Savage, and that is a less successful aspect of that series. It's another kind of comedy villain double act with him and his sergeant, who sycophantically follows his orders, and they try and create kind of comedy through, and it falls rather flat. And that was annoying you rather, wasn't it?
Yes, I was saying earlier such characters were overwritten caricatures, because that's very much what they are, and that's the thing Roger Damon Price used as well. The officious bus depot guy is one in the first series. Not a major role. He's giving Kevin some trouble when he's teleported back onto the bus after it's gone back to the depot. The Hiyokoshi character is also a bit of a caricature, but fortunately the actor is good enough to make more of the role than that, and to make it successful.
I always thought the least they could do with General Beaumont Savage in The Livingstones was actually have him be useful in the end and really cooperate, become a Tomorrow People ally. But actually, he's only pretending to cooperate and wants to blow everything up and is still a caricature and really an antagonist. Although, as I pointed out this time, and I mentioned before while talking about the denouement, he does accidentally turn out to be useful by knocking everyone out. The story needs that to happen for the aliens to leave the bodies and be destroyed, but actually it's an incredibly dangerous thing to do, and he's risking the lives of all these innocent villagers and Danny John Jules. But because we need a nice, quick, happy ending, everyone's alright, no one is badly injured by the bomb and the falling scaffolding and things, and everyone's able to go back and resume their lives without aliens inside them. And there we are, a pretty full discussion of the 90s version of The Tomorrow People. Bags of potential, some things very well pulled off, particularly by the two Christians and certain people from Mike and Angelo, principally Alexandra Millman and Jeff Harding, and something that's well worth watching and pulling apart and dissecting and enjoying as far as possible, and thinking about how it could have been better, and also enjoying what is good about it, which I think is true of most of the things we've podcasted about, and why I wanted to podcast about this one. If you join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in June, you'll hear us podcasting about
Sooty.
So until then, good night out there.
Whatever you are.